Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, bonjour tout le monde. Namaste, assalamu alaikum. First, please allow me to thank all the members of the Coalition for Minority Rights in India for the kind invitation and honor of being part of this webinar. And I also wanted to commend you on your March 2022 report for the UPR of India. I think it's essential reading to understand the magnitude and gravity of the human rights situation and violations that are being experienced by religious and other minorities. Essential, but also uncomfortable reading, we have to admit. I've also raised many of the concerns expressed in this report in a number of communications, thematic reports, and statements with other special rapporteur colleagues in recent years. The overall impression is that there is an alarming deterioration of the protection of minorities and their human rights. And I think what needs to be emphasized is that many of these human rights violations are not simply involving large numbers of individuals. They involve, in addition, a pattern of targeting of specific minorities as a community, as a group, in their entirety, as somewhat, in some cases, alien or threatening others, and somehow that they don't really belong or are not as deserving as other members of the country in India. Now, time does not permit me to go into great detail, but there is clearly a pattern of stigmatization and targeting minorities in India. And this includes using legislation such as the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act to shut down and shut up critics, including human rights defenders, in the name sometimes of national interest. And there is anecdotal evidence that suggests, once again, that organizations that are defending minorities are disproportionately targeted and impacted. Now, of course, this is very complex. There are nuances in every situation. But it's clear, for example, that hate speech and incitement to violence in social media has been increasing significantly. And also that there is increasing violence and brutality in recent years, targeting, once again, mainly minorities such as Muslims, Christians, and others. Many of you will know about minority Muslim women in recent years having experienced denigration, threats, and harassment in social media applications such as Suli Deals and Buli Bai, where they were listed for auction with photographs sourced without permission, obviously, and doctored. And to be blunt, and as some of you know, the word Suli is used as a derogatory Islamophobic slur, targeting Muslim females, Muslim women in India. There's increasingly extremely violent and hate speech stigmatizing religious or belief minorities and other minorities such as Dalits, including by senior political figures in social media. And what we're seeing is increasing hostility and violence against religious minorities, particularly Muslims. Muslims and other religious or belief minorities are massively the targets of hate speech. I've raised this in a number of reports and communications, including in my 2021 report to the UN Human Rights Council. And I also recently called for the protection of Dalit and minority women and girls from rape and sexual violence, and that this should be a national priority in India, and that the government needed to address these atrocities too often committed in the country by tackling the underlying prejudice, hate, and dehumanizing of Dalits and other minorities, which create the environment where women and girls become easy targets for such attacks. Unfortunately, there's also a growing threat of impunity, as too often those committing crimes against minorities are not always prosecuted or punished. And here again, there seems to be a trend. Unfortunately, again, while there are some prosecutions, especially of those who are rather high profile, and those who incite violence and hate speech against minorities, this doesn't happen consistently or sufficiently, even in high profile cases. And I expressed my concern very recently at the release of 11 men who had been jailed for gang rape in a Muslim woman. The picture many observers have painted in India is of growing intolerance and exclusion, and this includes anti-conversion laws, such as more recently in Karnataka, which legitimately, on the one hand, address coercive conversions, but then goes much further and makes it an offense to entice a conversion with a promise of marriage or other temptations, such as, quote unquote, better lifestyle. And this allows in very vague language civil servants to intervene, even to annul a marriage and any conversion that would be considered contrary to freedom of religion as understood under this legislation. Observers have pointed out that it appears the intention here to intimidate, to target minorities, especially those of Christian and Muslim faith in the state. When you look at this, exclusion of specific religious or other minorities is to be seen as taking root, even in relation to the most basic of rights, such as citizenship. In 2019, many of you know the National Citizenship Register was published for Assam, and as my and other UN mandates have indicated in a communication to the Indian government, we were and remain deeply concerned that close to 2 million people were left out of the list that was released, and that they now have to go through a judicial process which has its own problems to establish their citizenship. And that process is largely stalled, most recently in part because of the pandemic, but there are other systemic reasons. The 2 million people who may become stateless, amongst the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, seems are mainly members of Muslim, Bengali, and other minorities. This is not accidental, as our communication emphasized. That same year, 2019, and once again, it would be difficult to believe that this is a coincidence, India passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, which fast-tracks citizenship for Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, and Christian immigrants from the region who arrived in India before 2015, but lo and behold, it excludes Muslims. Not a coincidence. If you combine this with ongoing citizens or citizen registration drive in other parts of India, which have been described as means of excluding mainly Muslim and some other minority populations from Indian citizenship, we are seeing a risk of statelessness for millions and millions in the country. I could go on and on. There is the recently amended presidential constitution schedule CAS order of 1950, which was changed, which now excludes affirmative actions measures for Dalits who are Christian and Muslims. You have cow slaughter laws, which have been used to punish and even criminalize members of certain minority communities. And more strikingly, as I and other special rapporteurs have pointed out, there is the revocation of the constitutional special status of Indian-administered Kashmir, where Muslims are concentrated, and which largely disenfranchises them and weakens their legal protections as members of a minority in India that they had when Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, was a union territory with its own autonomy and government. There's only now one small union territory where most of the population is Muslim, which has maintained its autonomy, Lakshadweep, but even here, direct control from Delhi has increased in recent years, including an increased migration from outside the union of non-Muslims. The scale of denial of the human rights of these minorities, even through legislation and its application in the judicial system, is its systemic and national scope. The refusal of authorities to engage fully with global human rights mechanisms, including special procedures, and in some cases, the rising brutality and incitement of hatred and violence against minorities are of such gravity and magnitude, as I said at the start, that the international community needs, in my opinion, to step up to the task if we're serious about reversing the trend, a trend of a systemic pattern where certain minorities are targeted, marginalized, and demonize and become less than second-class citizens because of their religion or belief. It would seem, and I will conclude with this, that nothing short of perhaps an international investigative mechanism, as has been done by UN Security Council, Human Rights Council, or Human Rights Council resolutions for countries such as Syria, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, may be necessary, or some kind of similar report as was prepared under the UN Human Rights High Commissioner, even though that was delayed, on the Uyghurs in China. And I hope this panel will consider this and other ways forward to reverse a trend, which unchanged will bring us back to a very dark period of our history, where some minorities were not considered to be equal human beings in dignity, respect, and rights. I look forward to hearing the knowledge and exchanges from all of you later today. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Shukran. Dhanyavad.